The crystal chandeliers of the celestial grand ballroom dripped light like frozen diamonds. But for Corin Drake, the room was a cold, glittering prison. Her husband Gideon, a man forged in the frantic fires of Silicon Valley, held court, his voice a weapon slicing through the polite hum of the city's elite. He gestured towards her, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "My wife, Corin," he announced to the circle of sycophants, his smile a predator's gleam. "She dabbles in, what is it again, darling, painting? A charming little hobby to keep her occupied while the real work gets done." The laughter was light, but it landed on Corin like a physical blow, each titter a fresh wound in a marriage already bleeding out. She stood frozen, a masterpiece of composure on the outside, a storm of fury within, clutching a tiny, powerful secret in her hand, her phone with one number on speed dial. A number her husband had long forgotten held any real power. The Drake penthouse on the 72nd floor of the Olympian Tower was less a home and more a monument to Gideon's ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the sprawling metropolis, below a city he was convinced he had conquered. Every surface was polished marble or gleaming chrome. Every piece of furniture, a minimalist statement piece that cost more than a family car. It was a space designed to be admired, not lived in. A showroom for a life, not the life itself. For Corin Beaumont Drake, it was the most beautiful prison ever constructed. She had met Gideon 7 years ago. He wasn't the Gideon Drake, then just a ferociously ambitious programmer with a wildfire in his eyes and a revolutionary idea for data compression that no one else believed in. Corin, the daughter of Leland Beaumont, a man whose family name was woven into the very fabric of the city's financial history, saw past the threadbare suits and the obsessive work habits. She saw a brilliance, a passion that resonated with her own artistic soul. Her father's world was one of quiet, inherited power, of legacy and tradition. Gideon's was a world of disruption, of building something from nothing. She fell in love with the builder, not the billionaire he would become. Her father, a man of few words and unnerving perception, had been skeptical. "His ambition has no horizon, Corin." Leland had warned her, his voice calm as he surveyed a centuries-old oak tree on their family estate. "Men like that eventually see people as assets or obstacles. Be sure you know which one you are to him." Corin, blinded by love and a desire to forge her own path away from the long shadow of the Beaumont name, had dismissed his concerns. She believed in Gideon. She used her own trust fund, a modest sum by her family's standards, but a king's ransom to Gideon as the seed capital for his fledgling company, Nexus Corp. The success, when it came, was explosive. Nexus Corp didn't just succeed. It detonated, reshaping the tech landscape. Gideon went from a hungry innovator to a titan of industry in less than 3 years. The wildfire in his eyes became an inferno of arrogance. The man who had once cherished her belief in him now saw her as a relic of his past, a stepping stone he had already crossed. Their life became a carefully curated performance. He dressed her in designer clothes, not to make her feel beautiful, but to ensure she reflected his status. He encouraged her painting, not because he valued her talent, but because patron of the arts was a good look for a tech billionaire. He called her Cori in private, a name he hadn't used in years, and his voice was always laced with a weary condescension, as if her very presence was a tedious obligation. This evening was the annual Zenith Gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, held at the Celestial Grand, a hotel so exclusive that its name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. This year the gala was honoring Gideon as Innovator of the Decade. For him it was a coronation. For Corin It was another night on parade. She stood before the full-length mirror in their dressing room, a cavern of white marble and rose gold. The gown Gideon's stylist had chosen for her was a column of shimmering silver fabric by a designer she'd never heard of, probably some obscure European artist Gideon had discovered. It was stunning, but it felt like a costume. Cold, impersonal. "Is that what you're wearing?" Gideon's voice cut through her thoughts. He strode in already in his custom-tailored tuxedo, adjusting his onyx cufflinks. He didn't look at her, but at her reflection, his eyes scanning the dress with the critical gaze of a collector, inspecting an acquisition. "Your stylist sent it over this morning," she replied, her voice neutral. "It's fine," he conceded, which was his version of a crushing insult. "A bit safe. I thought I told Antoine to pick something that made a statement." He finally met her eyes in the mirror. "You look tired, Corin. Are you sleeping enough? You need to look sharp tonight. All eyes will be on us." On you, she thought. All eyes would be on him. She was just the elegant accessory on his arm. "I'm fine, Gideon." "Good. Now remember tonight when people like Councilman Roberts or Genevieve Atherton ask you about your work, try to talk about the charity board, the one I put you on, the Children's Literacy Foundation. It sounds better than the painting. The art world is for hobbyists and failures. We're in the business of changing the world, not just decorating it." The familiar sting of his words was dulled by repetition. She had once tried to explain to him what painting meant to her, the way she could lose herself in color, and form the way she could express the emotions that were trapped inside this polished cage. He had listened with a patient smile, the same smile he gave to a child explaining a fantasy game, before telling her it was a lovely way to pass the time. He walked up behind her, his hands landing on her shoulders. They were cold even through the fabric of her gown. "Just smile, look beautiful, and let me do the talking. That's all I need from you tonight," he murmured into her ear, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. It wasn't a request. It was a command. As he walked away, Corinne's gaze fell on her own phone, lying on the marble vanity. She picked it up, her thumb hovering over her father's contact photo. It was a picture of him, from years ago on his sailboat, the wind in his hair, a rare, genuine smile on his face. She remembered his words. "Be sure you know which one you are to him." For years she had tried to be an asset. She had hosted his dinners, charmed his investors, and swallowed his casual cruelties. But tonight, something felt different. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was soul deep. She was tired of being an obstacle to her own happiness, an obstacle he simply managed. She slipped the phone into her small, beaded clutch. It felt heavier than usual, like the weight of a decision yet to be made. She took one last look in the mirror, not at the designer dress or the diamond earrings Gideon had gifted her, but at her own eyes. They looked back at her, tired but clear, a flicker of a long-forgotten fire starting to smolder in their depths. The Beaumont fire. The one Gideon had tried so hard to extinguish. Tonight he would be celebrated as a king, but every king, no matter how powerful, has a weakness. Gideon had just reminded her of his. He had completely and fatally underestimated his wife. The Celestial Grand Ballroom was a symphony of excess. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their classical music a genteel veneer over the raw ambition that crackled in the air. Waiters moved like ghosts, their silver trays laden with flutes of Dom Perignon and canapés topped with shimmering pearls of caviar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, predatory murmur of 1,000 private deals being brokered between handshakes and air kisses. Gideon was in his element. He moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as a conquering hero. He was magnetic, his laughter booming, his hand clasping shoulders, his eyes alight with the thrill of being the center of this universe. Corin trailed in his wake, a silent, smiling satellite orbiting his star. She endured the fawning introductions and the vapid questions. "Oh, Corin, you look absolutely divine. Gideon is just a marvel, isn't he?" said Beatrice Langley, a socialite whose skeletal frame was draped in a shocking pink gown. Beatrice clung to Gideon's circle like a remorer, thriving on his reflected glory. "He's very driven," Corin replied, her smile feeling as brittle as spun sugar. "Driven, darling. He's a rocket." Beatrice shrieked with laughter. "And you're an artist, I hear. How quaint do you sell your little paintings?" Before Corin could answer, Gideon cut in, placing a proprietary hand on the small of her back. "Corin does it for the love of it, Beatrice. She doesn't need to worry about things like sales. It's a wonderful therapeutic outlet for her." He said it with a warm, indulgent smile, but Corin heard the clear subtext. It's meaningless. A child's pastime. The public mocking began subtly, a series of small, sharp cuts. They were standing with a group that included a grizzled oil tycoon and a stern-faced congresswoman. The conversation turned to a recent aggressive acquisition by Nexus Corp. "A bold move, Drake," the tycoon grunted. "Your board must have nerves of steel." Gideon laughed, a full-throated sound of pure ego. "My board does what I tell them to. The only person who questions my business decisions is my wife." He squeezed Corinne's arm, pulling her slightly forward. "She actually asked me if I'd considered the human cost of the merger." He mimicked her concerned tone, his voice dripping with saccharine pity. "Can you believe it? The human cost. I told her the only cost I'm concerned with is the one that gets us to $1 trillion valuation." The group chuckled politely. Corin felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. It was a gross oversimplification of a private conversation where she had merely asked about the thousands of employees who would be laid off. The main event was Gideon's award ceremony. After a fawning speech by the mayor, Gideon took the stage bathed in a reverent spotlight. He was a master orator, charismatic and commanding. He spoke of innovation, of the future, of breaking down old paradigms. And then he turned his attention to his personal life. They say that behind every great man is a great woman. He began, his voice softening as he looked directly at Corin. The entire ballroom turned to face her. "And my wife, Corin, has been a bedrock of support." The word bedrock sounded more like millstone. "While I was in the trenches coding for 18 hours a day, living on coffee and ambition, she was there. She taught me about the finer things." He paused for effect. "Things I'd never had time for. The right vintage of wine. The difference between a Monet and a Manet. The importance of having fresh flowers in the house." The audience cooed, interpreting it as a sweet tribute. But Corin knew what he was doing. He was painting her as a decorative, frivolous creature of leisure, a stark contrast to his rugged, self-made genius. He was erasing her contribution, the seed money, the early belief, the emotional support, and recasting her as part of the old world baggage he had to carry. But the final, deepest cut came later. They were gathered in a smaller, more intimate circle near the grand terrace. Gideon was holding his heavy crystal award, spinning it in his hands. Beatrice Langley, ever the sycophant, was gushing. "Gideon, this hotel is just breathtaking. You fit right in. You look like you own the place." Gideon's grin was sharp and cruel. Funny you should say that, Beatrice. We're actually in talks to acquire the Celestial Hotel Group. A little side project. Imagine a Nexus Corp hotel. The most technologically advanced hospitality experience in the world. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the group. Then he turned his eyes locking onto Corin with chilling intensity. But my wife here, she has reservations. She's sentimental. He reached out and touched a silk tapestry on the wall. She thinks we should preserve the historic charm. She doesn't understand that history is an anchor. The future is about demolition and rebuilding. You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, and you can't build an empire by being sentimental about old bricks and mortar. He then gestured expansively at Corin herself, his voice ringing out for everyone to hear. It's the Beaumont in her, you see. Old money. They're all about preservation, preserving their name, their status, their dusty heirlooms. They don't build things. They just curate the past. He leaned in his voice a stage whisper that carried across the terrace. I'm the one who builds. I took her father's money and turned it into a real fortune. She's a lovely piece for the collection, but she's still just a Beaumont. Beautiful, well-preserved, and utterly irrelevant in the modern world. The silence was deafening. The insult was so direct, so public, so utterly contemptuous, that even his most ardent admirers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their champagne glasses. Beatrice Langley's smile faltered for a second. Corin felt the world tilt. It wasn't just an insult to her. It was a desecration of her family, her father, her entire identity. He had taken her love, her support, her heritage, and twisted it into a punchline for his own aggrandizement. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. A strange glacial calm settled over her. The hurt was so deep it had frozen solid, becoming something else entirely. It became resolve. While Gideon basked in the shocked silence, soaking it up like applause, Corin turned slightly, shielding her clutch from his view. Her hands were perfectly steady as she opened it. She didn't need to look at the screen. Her thumb knew the exact position of her father's name. She met Gideon's triumphant, mocking gaze across the circle. He winked at her, a gesture of ultimate dominance. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile. Then, with a single deliberate press of her thumb, she made the call. Corin excused herself with a quiet murmur, "I need some air," and slipped away before Gideon could stop her. Her movements were fluid and graceful, betraying none of the seismic shock that had just ripped through her. She walked past the terrace through a gilded corridor, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men, and found a small, deserted alcove overlooking a quiet, manicured garden. The phone was already ringing in her ear. She pressed it close the cool glass, a comfort against her burning cheek. He answered on the second ring, his voice exactly the same as it always was, a low, calm baritone that held the steady assurance of a man who was never surprised. "Corin." It wasn't a question. "Father," she said, and was shocked at how her own voice held steady, a clear, cold bell in the sudden silence of her world. "Is everything all right?" Leland Beaumont asked. He didn't do small talk. He could discern the emotional weather of a situation from a single word. She took a breath, the air tasting of night-blooming jasmine from the garden below. "Gideon is accepting his award. I'm aware. I trust he's behaving himself." There was a dry, knowing edge to his tone. He had never trusted Gideon. This was the moment. The precipice. For 7 years, she had protected Gideon from her father's quiet disapproval. She had made excuses for his arrogance, smoothed over his social blunders, and presented a united front. That front had just been publicly demolished. He just informed a group of his associates, a congresswoman and a dozen others, that I am a lovely piece for his collection. He said my family, the Beaumonts, are irrelevant. He boasted that he took your money and turned it into a real fortune." She relayed the words without emotion, like a court stenographer reading back testimony. The facts were damning enough. They needed no embellishment. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't a shocked silence. It was the deep, profound stillness of a storm gathering far out at sea. When Leland spoke again, his voice had lost any trace of warmth. It was the voice he used in boardrooms just before he financially dismembered an opponent. "Where are you?" he asked. "The Zenith Gala, at the Celestial Grand." "I see." Another pause, this one shorter, more calculating. Corin could picture him perfectly in his study, a room panelled in dark, rich mahogany, a single lamp illuminating the leather-bound books that lined the walls. He would be in his armchair, a glass of something dark and aged, untouched on the table beside him. He would be perfectly still, but his mind would be moving at lightning speed. "He's proud of this hotel, isn't he?" Leland asked an odd, disconnected question. "He mentioned acquiring the group. He announced it tonight," Corin confirmed. "He called its history an anchor he was eager to demolish." "Did he now?" Leland murmured. It was a statement, not a question. "Corin, find a quiet place. A lounge, a powder room. Stay there. Don't engage with him. Don't say another word to him tonight. Do you understand?" "Yes, Father. I'll handle it. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Corin lowered the phone, her hand trembling slightly now that the act was done. She hadn't asked him for help. She hadn't needed to. She had simply presented the facts, and the Beaumont machinery, a force far older and more powerful than Gideon's flashy tech empire, had just been activated. Meanwhile, 100 miles away at the Beaumont family estate, Leland Beaumont placed his phone down on a polished mahogany desk. He did not slam it. He did not pace. He simply sat for a full minute. His hands steepled before him, his gaze fixed on a portrait of his late wife, Corin's mother. The expression on his face was one of profound, icy rage. It was the controlled fury of a patient man whose patience had just been exhausted. He pressed a button on an intercom on his desk. "Henry," he said, his voice calm. His long-serving assistant's voice came through instantly. "Yes, Mr. Beaumont." "Get me Robert Chen on the line, now." Robert Chen was the head of Beaumont Holdings' famously aggressive mergers and acquisitions division. Waking him at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night was the financial equivalent of launching a nuclear submarine. "And Henry," Leland added, his voice dropping even lower, "I want you to find out who the majority shareholder of the Celestial Hospitality Group is. His name is likely Kenjiro Tanaka. Get me a number for his private residence in Kyoto. I don't care what time it is there." "Right away, sir." Leland swiveled in his chair to face the large window that overlooked the sprawling ancient lands that had belonged to his family for generations. Gideon Drake saw history as an anchor. Leland Beaumont knew that history's true legacy was gravity. It was the immense, unseen force that held the world in place, that dictated the orbits of flashy, temporary stars. Gideon had made two fatal errors. He had mistaken quietness for weakness, and he had publicly insulted a Beaumont on the one thing a Beaumont valued above all else, his family's name. Leland picked up his untouched glass of Macallan 50. He didn't drink it. He just held the weight of it in his hand, feeling the solid, reassuring heft of the crystal. Gideon Drake wanted to own the Celestial Grand, a fine ambition for a boy playing with his first billion. Leland Beaumont was about to teach him the difference between buying a hotel and owning a legacy. And the lesson would be swift, silent, and utterly devastating. Back in the ballroom, Gideon was high on his own triumph. The public castration of his wife's heritage had been a masterstroke, he thought. It solidified his image as a ruthless, forward-thinking visionary, untethered by the sentimentalities of the past. He saw the mix of shock and awe in the eyes of those around him, and mistook it for respect. Corin did not return to his side. He barely noticed. Let her go sulk in the powder room, he thought. It was where she belonged. He was busy accepting congratulations for his speech, his award, his sheer audacity. The first ripple was almost imperceptible. A junior manager of the Celestial Grand, a nervous young man named Paul, approached the hotel's general management. Dubois, a man of impeccable Swiss hospitality training. "Sir," Paul whispered, his face pale, "I just received a Priority 1 alert from corporate. A full data lockdown, all forward booking systems, all financial projections. Everything is being firewalled to an external server. It says the directive is owner level." Mr. Dubois frowned, his perfectly placid demeanor ruffled for the first time in a decade. "Owner level Mr. Tanaka is in Japan. He never gets involved in operational data." "That's just it, sir. The authorization code isn't his." Before Dubois could respond, his personal phone vibrated with an encrypted message. He glanced at the screen. It was from the chief financial officer of the entire Celestial Hospitality Group. The message contained only 3 words: "Cooperate fully. Await instructions." Dubois looked across the ballroom, his professional gaze scanning the crowd. What in God's name was happening? His eyes fell on Gideon. Drake preening with his award, and a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Drake had been sniffing around for a hostile takeover for weeks. Had he managed to pull it off? In the middle of the gala. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. The second ripple was digital. A young hedge fund manager loitering near the terrace and scrolling through his terminal on a company-issued device saw something that made him choke on his champagne. A block trade. A single monumental block trade of Celestial Hospitality Group CHG stock had just been executed on the after-hours market. The volume was so enormous it could only mean one thing: a controlling interest had just changed hands. The price per share was a full 30% above market value, a premium so high it was practically a declaration of war. He looked up from his phone, his eyes wide, and sought out his colleagues. "Did you see that CHG trade?" he hissed. "Someone just bought the whole damn company." The news spread through the financial contingent of the party like a virus. Whispers turned to murmurs. Phones were checked. The murmur grew louder. Who was the buyer? The assumption, fueled by Gideon's own boasts, was that it was him. It was a power move, an ostentatious display of force designed to coincide with his award. Gideon, oblivious, was laughing at a joke when his own chief financial officer, a perpetually harried man named Wes, pushed through the crowd to his side. "Gideon, we have a problem," Wes said, his voice low and urgent. "Not tonight, Wes," Gideon said dismissively, clapping a banker on the back. "Tonight we celebrate." "No, you don't understand. Someone just bought a 55% stake in Celestial. The deal just closed. It wasn't us. Our offer wasn't even on the table yet." Gideon's smile vanished. Who has that kind of liquid capital to move that fast? We don't know. The buyer is a private holding company, completely anonymous. But Gideon, they paid a 30% premium. In cash. We were planning to offer a 10% premium in a stock and cash deal over 6 months. We've been blown out of the water. The blood drained from Gideon's face. He scanned the room, his mind racing. Who was his rival? Who had the audacity to pull this off on his night? His eyes narrowed, searching for a smug face, a triumphant competitor. He saw nothing. The world was still celebrating him, but the ground beneath his feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. Then the final undeniable ripple arrived. Mr. Dubois, the general manager. His face a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding, approached the stage. He walked directly to the podium, where the master of ceremonies was preparing to introduce the evening's musical guest. Dubois leaned in and whispered something. The MC's eyes widened. He tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Please?" His voice boomed, cutting through the rising chatter. The room fell silent. Mr. Dubois took the microphone himself. His hand was perfectly steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the staff and management of the Celestial Grand, I have a most unexpected announcement. As of 20 minutes ago, the Celestial Hospitality Group, including this hotel, has come under new ownership." A wave of gasps and excited murmurs swept the room. All eyes turned to Gideon Drake, who stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. This was it. His rival was about to reveal himself and humiliate him. Dubois continued, his voice clear and precise. "The new owner has expressed his deepest gratitude for you all attending the Zenith Gala this evening. However, he has also issued his first directive as proprietor." He paused, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. "The gala is over. He has requested that all guests, with the exception of Mr. Gideon Drake, kindly vacate the premises within the next 30 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a deep, profound void, sucking all the air and ego out of the room. Every single person turned to stare at Gideon, no longer with admiration, but with a morbid, fascinated pity. He was the guest of honor, the man of the hour, and he had just been unceremoniously, publicly and bizarrely kicked out of his own party. Gideon stood speechless, his face a mottled canvas of fury and confusion. He looked around for Corin, but she was nowhere to be seen. From the grand entrance of the ballroom, a figure emerged, walking with a slow, deliberate pace that commanded attention more than a shout ever could. He was an older man, dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored dark suit that made Gideon's flashy tuxedo look like a costume. He was not a large man, but he possessed a gravitational pull that bent the room's attention around him. It was Leland Beaumont. Leland Beaumont did not rush. He moved through the parting sea of guests with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the ground. He walked on which, as of half an hour ago, he did. The whispers followed him, a wave of dawning comprehension. Beaumont, Leland, Beaumont. What is he doing here? He ignored them all. His pale blue eyes, sharp and analytical, were fixed on one person only, Gideon Drake. Gideon watched him approach his mind, struggling to process the scene. This made no sense. Leland Beaumont was old money, a dinosaur. He invested in stable, budding things like bonds and real estate, not grand aggressive takeovers. He was supposed to be at his country estate reading a book, irrelevant. Leland stopped a few feet from Gideon. The handful of people in Gideon's inner circle, including Wes and a stunned Beatrice Langley, instinctively took a step back, as if the space between the two men was charged with a dangerous current. "Beaumont," Gideon managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. "What is the meaning of this?" Leland's expression was devoid of emotion. It was this unnerving calm that Corin had inherited. "I believe the general manager made it quite clear, Mr. Drake. The party is over. You bought the hotel." Gideon's voice cracked on the last word. The absurdity of it was too much to comprehend. "I bought the parent company," Leland corrected him, his voice soft but carrying in the cavernous silence. "The hotel came with it, along with 67 other properties across the globe. A charming little portfolio." He used Gideon's own condescending language, turning the knife with surgical precision. Gideon stared at him, his face contorting with rage. "Why?" "To do what? Spoil my night. This is a pathetic, petty move from a bitter old man." "Petty?" Leland raised a single eyebrow. The gesture was more eloquent than a shout. "Let me be clear. I have very little interest in your nights, Mr. Drake. My interest lies solely with my daughter. You publicly referred to her as a piece for your collection. You belittled her name. You belittled her family. You seem to be under the impression that the Beaumont name is, and I believe your word was, irrelevant." He took a step closer, and Gideon, for the first time in his adult life, felt a primal urge to retreat. "You see, you new money boys have a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth," Leland continued, his voice a lesson in quiet condescension. "You think it's about numbers on a screen, about valuations and burn rates. You splash it around, you build glass towers, you buy things to prove you can. But true wealth, the kind my family has cultivated for over 2 centuries, isn't something you spend. It's something you wield. It's a tool, and it is used for 2 purposes, to build and to protect. Mostly we build. But when someone threatens what we've built, or worse, someone we are sworn to protect, then the tool is used differently." Gideon's CFO, Wes, looked like he was about to have a seizure. He knew the Beaumont reputation. They never entered a fight they hadn't already won. "This is insane," Gideon sputtered. "You can't just buy a multi-billion-dollar company in an hour." "You can't," Leland agreed calmly. "But I can. When Mr. Tanaka in Kyoto receives an offer for a 30% premium all-cash wired from a Beaumont holding account within 60 seconds of his verbal agreement, things tend to move very quickly." He was delighted. He's been wanting to retire and focus on his koi pond. The sheer casual power of the statement staggered everyone who heard it. Gideon had been planning a complex, leveraged buyout for months. Leland Beaumont had accomplished it during a commercial break of whatever he was watching on television. "Now, about your other boast," Leland said, his gaze hardening. "You claimed you took my family's money and turned it into a real fortune." He gestured for his assistant Henry, who had materialized silently at his side. Henry handed him a slim tablet. "My people are very thorough, Mr. Drake. They've been looking into Nexus Corp for some time now. I was concerned about my daughter's financial exposure through her marriage to you." He tapped the screen. "It's a beautiful facade, a soaring stock price, glowing press. But it's built on a foundation of sand. You're over-leveraged. You've used Nexus stock as collateral for a series of incredibly risky side ventures, including your proposed bid for this hotel chain. And your last 2 quarterly reports. They're creative works of fiction. Your user growth is flat, your monetization is stalling, and your new flagship product is riddled with security flaws. You're not an empire builder. You're a gambler on a hot streak, and your luck is about to run out." Gideon went white as a sheet. Leland knew. He somehow knew everything. The moment the markets open in Tokyo on Monday, a full report on Nexus Corp's vulnerabilities compiled by my analysts will be accidentally leaked to the press. Leland stated not as a threat, but as a simple forecast like predicting rain. I imagine your stock price, the very thing propping up your entire house of cards, will have a rather dramatic correction. By Tuesday morning, your real fortune will be worth substantially less than the irrelevant seed money my daughter first gave you. Gideon looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but saw only a gallery of stunned, silent observers. Beatrice Langley was slowly backing away, her face a mask of horror, as if she was afraid of being caught in the blast radius. You can't," Gideon stammered, his bravado finally shattering, revealing the terrified, insecure man beneath. Leland's face was stone. "I can. I have. You built your empire on disruption. You boasted of demolishing the past. Consider this a lesson in history. History is not an anchor, Mr. Drake. It is a tidal wave. And you just tried to build your sand castle in its path." He slid the tablet back to his assistant. His gaze drifted past Gideon toward the alcove where he knew Corin was waiting. His work here was almost done. "You are trespassing on my property, Mr. Drake. The security team will escort you out. I suggest you go quietly." Leland turned his back on the broken billionaire, the ultimate gesture of dismissal. The confrontation was over. The execution was scheduled for Monday morning. As Gideon stood paralyzed, his world imploding in the center of the grand ballroom, Corin emerged from the alcove. She had heard everything. Her father had not raised his voice, had not used a single curse word, but he had systematically and completely dismantled the man who had tried to break her. She walked towards them, her silver dress catching the light, and for the first time all evening she felt like she was wearing armor, not a costume. Her posture was erect, her chin high. The quiet, accommodating wife was gone. In her place stood Corin Beaumont. Gideon saw her approaching, and a desperate, pathetic flicker of hope lit his eyes. His wife. His asset. Surely she would fix this. "Corin," he pleaded, his voice raspy. "Tell your father to stop. This is insane. It's a misunderstanding. Tell him—" Corin stopped directly in front of him, her eyes as calm and cold as her father's. She looked at this man, the man she had once loved, the man who had just humiliated her in the most profound way possible, and she felt nothing but a distant pity. "There is no misunderstanding, Gideon," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "He is doing this because you left him no choice. You left me no choice. But our life, everything we built," he stammered, gesturing around the opulent room, a room that was no longer his playground. "What did we build?" She countered, her voice sharp. "You built a company. You built a public image. You built this cage of a life, and you expected me to sit in it and look pretty. You didn't build a marriage, Gideon. You acquired a wife." She reached into her clutch and pulled out not her phone, but a folded set of legal documents. She held them out to him. "What is this?" he asked, his hands trembling too much to take them. "This is the hobby you so charmingly dismiss," she said. "While you were busy changing the world, I was meeting with my own lawyers for the past 6 months. This is a petition for divorce, Gideon." The air left Gideon's lungs in a painful rush. This was a betrayal he couldn't even begin to process. "But that's not all," Corin continued, her voice relentless. "You see, you made another fundamental miscalculation. You assumed my trust fund, the irrelevant Beaumont money, was our only asset in my name. You forgot about the original shares in Nexus Corp I received in exchange for my seed capital. The ones you insisted I keep in my maiden name for tax purposes in the early days. Wes, the CFO, let out a small, strangled gasp. He knew exactly which shares she was talking about. According to the prenuptial agreement your own lawyers drafted, Corin said, her memory of the document flawless. Those shares are considered my separate premarital property. They represent 7% of Nexus Corp, a non-controlling but very, very significant stake. She let that sink in. Gideon stared at her, his face a mess of confusion and horror. "When the market opens on Monday," she said, echoing her father's chilling forecast, "and your house of cards begins to tremble, I will be selling my entire stake. All of it. A 7% block sale, announced pre-market from one of the company's original investors. It will be seen as a catastrophic vote of no confidence. It won't just start a panic, Gideon. It will be an avalanche." She was not just leaving him. She was not just being rescued by her father. She was taking control. She was delivering the killing blow herself. The quiet, artistic wife he had mocked and dismissed had just revealed herself to be the executioner. You planned this," he whispered, finally understanding the scope of his defeat. "No," Corin said, and for the first time a flicker of genuine sadness crossed her face. "I hoped I would never have to do this. I kept hoping the man I married was still in there somewhere. But tonight, you made it perfectly clear he's gone. You didn't just insult me, Gideon. You freed me. You reminded me that I am not Corin Drake, an accessory to a billionaire. I am Corin Beaumont, and we protect our own." She let the documents fall from her hand. They fluttered to the plush carpet between them, a final damning testament to his failure. She turned to her father, who was watching her with an expression of immense, quiet pride. He held out his arm for her. She took it, and together they turned and walked away, leaving Gideon Drake standing alone in the middle of the cavernous, empty ballroom, the soon-to-be dethroned king of a fallen kingdom, surrounded by the echoes of his own arrogance. The fall of Gideon Drake was not a singular, deafening crash, but a series of sickening fractures that splintered the very foundations of his world. On Monday morning, the Nexus Corps headquarters, usually a humming hive of aggressive ambition, was a tomb of silent panic. Screens glowed with cascading red numbers, each digit a drop of blood from a fatal wound. The first leak in the Financial Chronicle was a surgical strike exposing the rot beneath the company's gleaming facade. But it was the second announcement, the pre-market filing of Corin Beaumont's intent to sell her entire 7% stake, that turned the panic into a full-scale rout. Gideon stood alone in his glass-walled office, high in the Olympian tower, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom that was no longer his. He watched the ticker on his monitor, mesmerized by the sheer velocity of his own destruction. The number which had been his entire identity, the metric of his genius, was in free fall. It was an avalanche, just as she had said. Phone calls from his board, once deferential, were now clipped and accusatory. Margin calls from his creditors, once unthinkable, lit up his phone with a terrifying urgency. He had built his life on a mountain of leverage, and the mountain was now collapsing into the sea. His social extinction was just as swift. 2 weeks later, looking disheveled and haunted, he walked into Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive he had once had the chef flown to his private jet. The maitre d', a man who had previously greeted him with bows and fawning praise, looked at him with a polite blank stare. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice laced with ice. "We are fully booked tonight." Gideon looked past him and saw a dozen empty tables. The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold sickness in the pit of his stomach. The final nail in his social coffin was a quote from Beatrice Langley in a society column. When asked about Gideon, she had laughed her brittle laugh and replied, "Gideon who, oh him, such a dreadful flash in the pan." He was no longer a player, he was an anecdote. While Gideon's world shrank to the four walls of his empty penthouse, Corinne's was expanding into the light. She never set foot in the Olympian tower again. The day after the gala, a discreet team of movers dispatched by her father cleared her art studio and personal effects. They worked with silent efficiency, leaving behind Gideon's chrome furniture and cold marble surfaces, taking only the things that held life and memory. Her new home was a sprawling loft in the city's rejuvenated warehouse district. Where the penthouse had been a sterile showcase of glass and steel, the loft was a sanctuary of warm, brick-aged wooden beams and vast north-facing windows that flooded the space with a gentle, consistent light. For the first time in years, Corin felt she could breathe. The air didn't smell of industrial-strength cleaner and Gideon's expensive cologne. It smelled of oil paint, turpentine, and the intoxicating perfume of freedom. For the first week, she didn't paint. She slept. She read. She walked through the vibrant, artistic neighborhood, a ghost of a woman slowly regaining her color. Then one morning, she stretched a massive, intimidatingly blank canvas. She stood before it for a long time. Then she began to work. It wasn't the careful, controlled painting of her past. It was a raw, physical act. She attacked the canvas using palette knives and bold, violent strokes. Colors bled into each other, the cold, metallic silver of her gala dress, the glittering false gold of the ballroom chandeliers, the deep, suffocating black of her marriage. It was all there, a storm of memory and emotion. The divorce was as quiet and clinical as a surgical procedure. Gideon, a ghost of the titan he had been, sat opposite her in a lawyer's conference room, flanked by a single overwhelmed attorney he could barely afford. He was diminished, his tailored suit hanging loosely on his frame. He did not meet her eyes. Corinne, poised and calm, signed the papers with a steady hand. She wanted nothing from their shared life. The sale of her Nexus shares, executed with perfect timing, had already secured her future. As she left the room, she felt a final faint pang of sorrow, not for the monster he had become, but for the brilliant, passionate man she had once loved, a man now buried forever under the rubble of his own ego. 6 months later, the Corin Beaumont Gallery opened its doors. It was the antithesis of the Zenith Gala. The air buzzed with excited, authentic conversation. The crowd was a vibrant mix of paint-splattered students, shrewd critics, and people who genuinely loved art. Corin, dressed in a simple but elegant deep blue dress, moved through the space, not as an ornament, but as its gravitational center. The undeniable heart of the exhibition was her own work, a single monumental canvas hanging on the far wall. It was titled simply, "The Celestial Grand." It was the storm she had unleashed in her first weeks of freedom. The canvas was a maelstrom of texture and color. Shards of metallic silver and gold leaf were embedded in thick black impasto, looking like the beautiful, dangerous debris of an explosion. But from the center, bursting through the darkness, came an unstoppable eruption of life. Streaks of cerulean blue, the color of her father's eyes, and the sea he loved. A fierce, defiant orange, the color of a sunrise. And a deep, resilient green, the color of new growth after a fire. It was a painting of utter demolition, but more than that, it was a masterpiece of rebirth. Leland Beaumont watched his daughter from a quiet corner. He saw her engage with a young art student, explaining the technique she had used to create the illusion of shattering glass. Her face was animated, her gestures passionate. She was not just inhabiting her life, she was creating it, curating it with the same focus and vision she applied to her gallery. He finally made his way through the crowd to her side. She turned, and the brilliant smile she gave him held all the warmth that had been missing for so long. "Father, I'm so glad you could make it." His eyes were on her painting. He studied it for a long moment, his gaze analytical, yet full of a deep, unspoken emotion. "You didn't just redecorate, Corin," he said, his voice a low murmur just for her. "You rebuilt from the foundations up." "You gave me the blueprints," she replied softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You reminded me that a Beaumont foundation is made of stone, not sand." He looked from the painting back to her face, seeing not the tired, fragile woman from the Gala, but the strong, formidable one who stood before him, now her own master. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. "The foundation was always yours," he said. "You just had to remember where you put it." She raised her glass in a silent toast, her eyes shining under the gallery lights. Across the room, her painting blazed a testament not to an ending, but to a spectacular, hard-won, and beautiful new beginning. And there you have it. A story not just about revenge, but about reclamation. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet, underestimated force that waits for the perfect moment to reveal its power. Corin Beaumont was dismissed as a hobbyist, a decorative piece, but she proved that heritage intelligence and a will of iron are a more formidable combination than any flashy tech fortune. Gideon Drake learned the hard way that when you mock the foundation, the entire building is destined to collapse. What do you think? Was Gideon's downfall deserved, or was Leland's move too extreme? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Corin's journey to freedom and enjoy stories where the powerful get their ultimate comeuppance, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribing to the channel for more dramatic tales. Your support is what allows me to keep bringing these stories to life. Thank you for listening.